Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about just all of the craziness in college football. Tried to break it down into tiers for you guys. Not necessarily tiers in terms of I think tier 1 is better than tier 2, but just trying to break it down into groups because it is very hard to get a beat on where everyone sits as of right now. And we'll kind of get into that in this segment, talking about the winners and the losers from week 2. And the most obvious answer of all time, in my opinion, is the winners from week 2 were us. The college football fans got a huge win this past weekend because going into this weekend, it was all talk about, well, we got Michigan, Texas, and we have Tennessee, NC State, I guess, and we have Nebraska, Colorado, I guess. But at the end of the day, this is a pretty weak slate. There's nothing here. There's no juice in this grouping, and we might just be able to take this week off. You can never take a week off in college football, and that was proven tenfold this past weekend. We had NIU give us the moment of the week, Tulane, Boise State, and many more gave upset bids. Cal got a big win over Auburn that we'll talk about a little bit later. Iowa State was a downright classic, and you see how much it means to those fans. Oklahoma State, Arkansas was tons of fun, and Oklahoma avoided a big-time scare. So overall, I think we're talking about this, and it's kind of funny. When you look at that slate, you were looking at those three games, right? You were looking at Texas, Michigan, Tennessee, NC State, Colorado, Nebraska. No way to avoid that. And then Iowa State right up there with them. But out of those four, one really delivered. One was the game that everyone was tuned into from start to finish, and that was Iowa State. So it was kind of a funny week where a lot of people were right. The big-time games did not live up to the hype, and the big-time games were not as crazy as we want. But then everything else filled in. Everything else was absolutely incredible. The Notre Dame game, the Iowa State game being absolutely crazy. Oklahoma State, Arkansas just competing to lose that game. Oklahoma looking a little bit all over the place. A number of different things that happened this past weekend that were just absolutely incredible. So you can say there's a weak slate all you want, and people will say this upcoming week, I can promise you, it's never a weak slate. College football is absolutely crazy, and it thrives when their fans think that they might just have a chance to take an off week. So be locked in every single week because this was a perfect example of how things can go a little bit differently than we think it might go. But a loser is the college football fans because we talked about the craziness of this past weekend. I have no idea who's good. It's one of those issues that we get into, I feel like right around this time pretty much every year, but at the end of the day, this feels a little bit more aggressive than past years. We had a Clemson team walk into a game against Georgia, just get railroaded. It was absolute domination for Georgia in the second half of that game, and we had so many questions. We said Clemson had nothing going, the offense is all over the place, and then they dice App State to pieces, and a lot of that was App State giving them wide open passes, but at the end of the day, I have no earthly idea if Clemson is really good, if Georgia is just a world beater that it could play in the NFL tomorrow. I don't know if App State is downright terrible and Clemson just made them. All of this is all over the place, is the point I'm trying to make. We have no earthly idea who is good, who is bad, what wins mean a lot, and what wins don't mean a lot as of right now, because we just had Texas go up to Ann Arbor and get a big win against Michigan. Michigan could end the year as a 7-5 team, and then you're looking at that and saying, okay, Texas did what they were supposed to do. Now, I still think it's an impressive win because anytime you have to go up to Ann Arbor and get a win, it's going to be tough, but still, it definitely could change a lot in the next couple of weeks, and it's one of those things that happens just about every year, but I think this year might be more aggressive than most in terms of just trying to figure out who is good, who is bad, and where your team lies and all of that craziness. But moving on, the winner was the group of five. I think that's a obvious truth coming out of this week. Northern Illinois obviously had the biggest win of the group of five, but you look around the country, I mean, you had Tulane, you had Boise State play a really good game against Oregon that frankly, they very well could have won if Noah Whittington had dropped that ball and no one picked it up in the end zone. But at the end of the day, it was a crazy, crazy week for the group of five where they showed that they can play with these teams. They showed that they can get into the playoff and possibly make some things happen. Now, I still think there's a big-time question mark there because I don't know how good Notre Dame is right about now. But overall, I think it was a really, really fun week for the group of five, and it showed you that although, yes, there is a gap between the Power Four and the Group of Five teams, when you get on that field and you think you can win as a group of 5 team, a lot of things can fall into place. That's exactly what Northern Illinois felt going onto that field, and we saw what happened. It was really, really impressive, and it's one of those things that group of 5 teams going forward have such a moment to build off this and keep it moving, especially Tulane, who has a big-time game against Oklahoma this weekend. If they can keep this rolling, there's a world where possibly one of the one of the buys in the college football playoff goes to a group of 5 team, because maybe the ACC just gets beat up, maybe the Big 12 gets beat up, and there's a 12-0 or 11-1 Boise State team that is just tearing apart people. I would be one that might argue that they deserve that bye week. But obviously plenty more time to go there, but a huge, huge weekend for the group of 5 that might just set them up for a little bit of success when it comes around to make the playoff decisions. A loser was the high-flying Week 1 offenses, and this is something that happens just about every year, where you have a team like Auburn play Alabama A&M in Week 1, look just incredible, Cam Coleman running all over the place, all these freshman wide receivers all over the place, and then you run into a team that's just a little bit better in Cal, well, a lot of bit better in Cal, and they take you and they beat you. So there's definitely going to be this all around the country, and I think it's probably going to continue to happen into Week 3 a little bit, but Auburn had a bad performance. Penn State's offense looked clunky at times. Alabama had issues early on in that game. So a lot of them took fairly sizable steps back, but that's part of the season, right? There's always going to be moments where your offense doesn't look quite as good as it usually does. And for Auburn, I think it's probably a bigger issue. If I'm being honest, I think that offense is probably going to look clunky for a while, if I had to imagine. But overall, I think it's one of those things that you could panic about it. You could go crazy, but I don't think it's all that big of a worry. Penn State, I don't think was all that bad, if I'm being totally honest. I think they just missed a couple of moments that could have changed that game drastically. And then Alabama was able to put up the big plays to make that look a little bit better, but definitely had issues through 3 quarters. So overall, not overreacting to this one by any means, but there were a couple of teams that had to feel really good about their offenses in Week 1 that don't feel very good about it right about now. But the winner was the SEC to me. I think the SEC went to work this weekend. There were some bad performances with Auburn losing to Cal, obviously, and then you had Bama and Oklahoma struggle with relatively inferior opponents for sure, but you had 2 huge wins, obviously. Texas going up to Ann Arbor and getting a big-time win is absolutely massive. People asking questions about how good this Michigan team is, as am I, definitely still have those questions, but I think whenever you can go up into that environment and beat a team that has all the confidence in the world, it makes you feel really good, especially when you beat them that way. And then on the other side, Tennessee just get a huge road win against NC State, road neutral site, whatever you want to call it. They got a big win over NC State where they just dominated. And I think the biggest thing about these 2 wins isn't necessarily that they're unpredictable, because I think everyone felt that Tennessee and Texas were the better teams going into these games. But at the end of the day, any chip that the SEC can have over these other conferences when you come to college football playoff time is going to be a big deal. So let's say, Texas goes on, they lose to a team like Oklahoma. Let's say Oklahoma fixes a lot of things. They beat Texas and they find their way to 10-2 at the end of the year. And then you have a Michigan team that finds their way a little bit, is also at 10-2. Oklahoma would get in because Texas went up to Michigan, beat them, and then Oklahoma beat Texas. So I think it's one of those things that maybe it doesn't have too big of an impact at the end of the day, but I think it could have at least some of an impact about how they go about the college football playoff and saying, well, we saw an SEC team beat a Big Ten team at their place. That has to mean something at the end of the day. So it'll be interesting to watch that develop, and maybe it means nothing, maybe it means everything at the end of the day. But a loser was home field advantage. There were so many teams that walked into other environments and just got a really dominating win in some different respects. Texas beat Michigan in Ann Arbor, and if you look at that stadium after that game, you would have thought it was a Texas home game. They dominated that, and huge shout out to the Texas fans for kind of taking over that game in the latter portions of it. And then Tennessee dominated NC State and Charlotte. Obviously a little bit different, definitely not necessarily a home game for NC State, but still one of those games that Tennessee had to go further than you did. So I'm going to count it as a home game at least a little bit for NC State. Iowa State going to Iowa City is probably the biggest one here, because at the end of the day, it felt like the home field advantage was going to play a big time part in the first half, and then Iowa State came out in the second half and just took them to the woodshed, just totally took over. And then finally, Notre Dame. That was the obvious example. The Notre Dame crowd did as best they could, but the play on the field was just bad enough to keep them from winning that game. And then you had other games that were a little bit scary. Penn State letting Bowling Green in that one, Oregon, Bama. So you had a couple of games that you felt like with them playing at their home stadium, particularly Bama was one that I was circling, playing at their home stadium against a team that really gave them a run for their money last year. You had to assume they were going to bounce back, but that did not necessarily happen. So really impressive performances from a lot of road teams this past weekend and a lot of home atmospheres that have a little bit to figure out going into week 3. The winner, again, was the people that are fans of 90s college football because we got Nebraska back in the picture finally. Nebraska got a huge win over Colorado this past week. We can talk about how good of a team Colorado is, and frankly, we will here in a couple of segments. But at the end of the day, that's a big-time win. That's a win that everyone in that program knew was going to be one that they had to get, was going to be one that if they didn't get, people were going to have big-time questions, and they dominated this team from start to finish. So a huge win for them. Tennessee got a big-time win and is back up where you want them to be. And then you got USC right there, Miami right there, so you can include the 2000s in this just a little bit. But overall, there's so many fun storylines in the early parts of the season. The best one to me is seeing some of these brands pop back up. USC, Miami, Nebraska, Tennessee, all of these teams that really should have been a bigger part of the conversation for a long time that just have faded off just a little bit for the last little bit. But it's been incredible to watch them kind of flourish over the first 2 weeks. Still plenty of road to grow and teams to beat coming forward. But at the end of the day, a huge win and one of those things that you just love to see. Those type of brands find their way back up to the top of college football, and we'll see what they can do the rest of the way. The loser is anyone that has UGA on their schedule. We talked about this a little bit earlier in this segment. I don't know how good Clemson is. I don't know how good App State is. I know how good Georgia is. It is terrifying how good this team is. I believe it was Brandon Walker that called them a rolling ball of chainsaws. That's what they are. They're terrifying in every single aspect of the game. You thought you had an advantage at defensive tackle. Well, they pushed around Clemson for the majority of that game. You thought that the back end was going to be a little bit susceptible. Well, they're playing everything perfectly, and Daniel Harris is playing awesome football, as is Julian Humphrey. So I understand they played Tennessee Tech this past weekend, and I understand we still have questions about this Clemson team, but if you have UGA on your schedule, just strap in, because it might just get ugly in a hurry. This team is absolutely ridiculous, and I'm not trying to separate them from the pack too much because I think Texas and OU and Ohio State, I got totally lost there, and Ohio State are right there with them, but this is a scary team, and it's one of those teams that we've been scared of for a long time, but now they got a quarterback that can hit all the right buttons, and if that's the case, then I don't know if there's a soul on planet Earth that is going to beat the Georgia Bulldogs over the next little bit, but we'll see what happens. Obviously, plenty of places for them to stumble with Alabama, Ole Miss, Texas down the way, but this is a ridiculous team, and if you have them on your schedule, just temper expectations in that game. I'll just put it that way for the time being. But let's take our second break here, and when we come back, we're going to do a little bit of a week 2 whip around. I didn't quite get to all the games that I wanted to, so we'll get to all of them right after this, so stick with us.